everyone, and welcome to today's web on Ciphr. Today we're looking at sexual harassment and the Worker Protection Act value compliance. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss this important topic. I'm thrilled to be joined by Allcock, our Head of Diversity here at Ciphr. Hi Anne, how are you?
Hi, very well, thank you, and welcome everyone. Nice to see you all today.
Fabulous. And I'm also thrilled to be joined by Hiran Odedra, who's founder of Unity Bridge Consulting and an associate consultant and trainer with Ciphr e-learning. Welcome, Hiran. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and welcome everyone. Looking forward to hearing your questions and comments today.
Fantastic. So here's just a quick look at our agenda. I'll share a little bit about Ciphr just in case you're new to our company and what we do. And then I'll hand over to Hiran and Anne, and they'll be talking about why enhancements to the WPA were needed, steps to prevent sexual harassment. And usually we're going to pop the Q&A in the middle because we've got lots to cover, and there'll be a nice free-flowing conversation between Anne and Hiran. So if you do have questions, send them in at any time. And then we'll also look at how to create a speak-up culture, which fits really nicely to this question we're looking at of preventing sexual harassment. And we'll also share a little bit about how the content and services we offer can support you with compliance in this area. We do want this to be super interactive, so say hi in the chat and share where you're working and whether you're a specialist in the DE&I area or coming at this from more of a generalist point of view, perhaps some of the challenges that you've come into so far. And there's also the Q&A panel. If you want to send in your questions for Hiran and Anne, use that Q&A area specifically, and that just helps us assess the common points and key questions that we need to pick up today. So a little bit about Ciphr. This nice bubble diagram shows a little bit about what we offer, which is basically covers the entire employee lifecycle from onboarding and recruitment all the way through to HR software management, just your central HR software, through to payroll, software and bureau, and of course the things we're looking at today, which is e-learning content as well as D&IB consultancy. When it comes to e-learning, we offer a suite of off-the-shelf courses, and we'll be happy to give you a free trial of one of those, the sexual harassment course, later today. But we also offer the option of tailoring those courses to your requirements, creating bespoke content, which is entirely suited to your company. And then Anne also heads up our diversity practice, so she can offer a wide range of D&IB consultancy, face-to-face and virtual options. Basically, whatever you need, we can tailor an option to you. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Anne and Hiran to take us through the requirements of the Worker Protection Act. Thanks both.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. So Hiran and I are going to have a bit of a conversation about this new legislation and hopefully offer you some very practical tips and ideas on how you can actually ensure that your organisation is compliant. So and again, as Catherine said, please do pop questions in the chat, and we'd be really pleased to answer those. So just as a kick-off, I'm guessing you're all aware of this new legislation because you're here, interested very much in the topic. So I'm just going to give a couple of sentences of an overview around what the legislation is, and then Hiran and I are going to start a bit of a conversation with some questions for each other, which we'll sort of share. Hiran's going to be offering her experience and expertise in this area. So again, hope it's really useful. So the Worker Protection Amendment of Equality Act 2010, the Worker Protection Act of 2023 came into force on the 26th of October 2024. So the legislation is already in place. And this new law puts a positive legal onus on organisations to take what are referred to as reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment of employees and workers. And in order to ensure compliance, so it's every employer in the UK needs to demonstrate that they have taken and will continue to take practical and proactive action to create a harassment-free workplace. So there are a couple of very different things about what we have now as a result of this new legislation and what we had previously, because as many of you will be aware, we've had legislation around sexual harassment for several years now in the UK. So just to mention a couple of things, it's about preventing the harassment, the sexual harassment of workers, of employees, and this extends to what we call third-party harassment. So this is extending to customer or client-facing situations where employees will be in contact with those clients and customers, and it's also about ensuring a sexual harassment-free environment in those types of situations as well. It's a preventative duty, and it's also an anticipatory duty. So it's about action that you need to take in advance of sexual harassment happening, and also to stop it happening again in the future. And it's really a step change. It's a step change for employers, and it's a step up for employers in terms of actions that need to be taken. So that's why we're here talking about it. It's different to what we've had before. It requires employers to do new and different things in an anticipatory way in order to prevent sexual harassment. So that's the backdrop, that's the context that we're working in. So I just want to, my first question here, and our first sort of topic of conversation is, why? Why have we got this now? We've already got the Equality Act, and before that we had the Sex Discrimination Act. Sexual harassment is clearly unlawful discrimination. Why has this been revisited? Why has the law been strengthened in this area?
Great question, Anne. Thank you for that. And for those of us who've been around for many years in this space, will remember when the Equality Act came into place and the procedures and policies that we had to put into place at that point. The difference now is that there has been an increase in sexual harassment cases generally, but also in the number of high-profile cases, and we're still seeing that now. You watch the news, and every few months there's a different one that crops up. But actually, not just in the celebrity circles, it's happening more and more in workplaces. So the Worker Protection Act has strengthened what we already had in place through the Equality Act, and as you said earlier, Anne, it's about putting in preventative steps and reasonable steps to make sure that you're preventing sexual harassment from occurring in the workplace. So in the past, where we might be a bit more reactive, so our policies would focus on what definitions of harassment would be, and also talk about the process for reporting it. Now it's more around identifying the risks associated with sexual harassment in the workplace and what employers are doing to mitigate those risks as well. And so now it's looking at the culture of workplaces. What kind of environment is your workplace, and what steps do you need to take? That might be different to other companies. So whilst we all have to all organisations have to comply with it, the way they do it will be different according to industries as well. But also, I think the important thing is to try and identify where it's likely to happen and what steps you take to mitigate it.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so Catherine, could we have the next slide, please? So what we've got just some figures on the slide here that we just want to show you to sort of consolidate and reinforce some of the points that we're making through our conversation. So if we just go back a little bit, obviously the legislation is very, very new. It's come in since we've had a new government, but going back to 2020, the then government did a survey around sexual harassment, and there was some disturbing findings, probably things that people working in this space have realised and known for quite some time. And there have been many surveys on sexual harassment and the prevalence of sexual harassment in the workplace. But just a few things stood out. So this is really the backdrop to the why, the scale, the scope. And I think Hiran's point about, we're always hearing now on the news about really high profile cases. We've recently had McDonald's, we had the CBI, you think about the CBI, Confederation of British Industry, as an organisation, this type of behaviour, it's quite staggering that this should be happening in these types of organisations and companies. So really, you know, we're looking there, you know, 29% figure there on that first bullet. It's about the occurrence of sexual harassment. It's also about the manifestation. What do we know? And interestingly there, you know, the most common form of harassment or around jokes, you know, inverted commas, and staring. It's about the different contexts in which sexual harassment occurs, a recognition that outside the actual workplace, there is most prevalence in that client or customer facing situations, and also in general socializing situations for employees. Perpetrators, you know, mostly men, but actually, you know, women can deliver sexual harassment as well as men. That's important to recognise. Often more senior people, their behaviour towards more junior members of staff or those on the same level. And I think also pointing out, you know, this the link with other aspects of identity. So again, we've known for some time that younger women in particular are more likely to experience sexual harassment at work. We're talking about women from ethnic minority groups. We're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual people. And we're talking, interestingly, this survey found that those with significant disability or significantly limiting disability were also prone to sexual harassment. So that intersectionality element is also really important to recognise, and I think that's something we need to keep in mind too. Next slide, please, Catherine. Yeah, just bringing up a little bit more to more recent context. The TUC did a poll in 2023, and 2 out of 3 women they found of younger women had experienced sexual harassment, and on many circumstances the behaviour was repeated. There were repeated incidents, and again, perhaps not unsurprisingly for many of us working in this space, most incidents actually go unreported for various reasons, for fear of people of retaliation or victimization because they've made that complaint, which can impact career. So that's really just a backdrop to the why this is important. We need to keep all that in mind, the reality of harassment, sexual harassment in our organisations. So, okay, another question for you, Hiran. What does this mean in practice then? What does the new Worker Protection Act mean for employers? What action do they need to take? I think one of the requirements that is very different or feels a bit different and can feel a bit scary is the mention of undertaking risk assessments around sexual harassment. Is there a blueprint? What do we need? What do we need to do?
Great question, Anne, and I think you're absolutely right. There are so many people that have approached me and said that it really concerns them, the element of the risk assessment and what should that include. And I think it's about being pragmatic for your own environment. But before we go into some of the blueprint and what a risk assessment can include, I think it's important to mention that the measures to prevent sexual harassment aren't just for employees, but they also apply to third parties as well. So that could be suppliers, contractors, partners, or sponsors that an organisation works with. So it's making it clear and thinking about that external element too. But some of the things that for you all who are listening, actually, to consider when putting together a risk assessment, if you haven't already, is to think about things like cultural norms. And this is quite different, isn't it? Because in typical risk assessments, you just have kind of facts, figures, policies, for example. But in this, it would be around looking at what's acceptable in your organisation. Is it a boys' club kind of culture? Is there a culture where inappropriate behaviour or banter is deemed appropriate? So they're the kinds of things. And if it is, then I would encourage you to kind of say, what can you do to mitigate that around training, development, workshops? How high is that risk and what impact is it having on your employees? The other thing is around looking at contact with third parties. So as I said before, around contractors, suppliers, and there's a higher prevalence of sexual harassment in particular industries around hospitality, retail, catering and care, particularly because there is that third party element, and because of the imbalance of power. For example, if someone's a customer or a client, people will kind of let certain behaviours go, which is what this duty is to try and prevent as well. Again, I mentioned briefly unequal power imbalances. So if you have an industry or an organisation which is very male dominated at the leadership level, that's an important consideration, because actually you might find that women are more fearful to speak up and to report because of that concern around losing their jobs or progression within an organisation. But this also applies to early careers kind of team members. So for example, if you have interns, graduates or work experience students, it's also thinking about them in your risk assessment. How are you protecting them? Because they are new to the world of work, but they also might not be familiar with your reporting and your policy. So it's making sure that you go a bit further to protect those as well. Things like work-related events and conferences. So of course, this duty doesn't apply just to the workplace itself. It applies to events, conferences, where there might be travel involved, consumption of alcohol, all of those types of things. And also if you're in a client-facing environment, that pressure to maybe win client work can also have an impact in the behaviours that you might be willing to, or feel that you've got to kind of contend with. But also thinking about work-related parties and events as well. So I don't want to be a downer on this and saying you can't have fun, but it's just about thinking about the impact, being respectful and maintaining the dignity and respect of all of your employees in that context. But finally, we mustn't forget the online element as well, because harassment can occur through emails and also through social media. And we're seeing more and more of that because people feel that they can perhaps hide behind a computer screen or a keyboard. So that's important to think about that. But like, as I said, it's about, it's probably better to have fewer elements on your risk assessment, but that are relevant to you and that you can really make a difference on. And things like the training that you already have in place, or any policies and procedures, so they can be included in that. So there's probably some great work that's already going on with employers that they can include as part of that. So it's not like starting from scratch completely.
Great, thanks, Hiran. That's really helpful. You know, some great thoughts and examples about, you know, specific and particular groups of staff who might be impacted. And I think what you've drawn out there is really the importance of thinking about, you know, one size doesn't fit all for this legislation. What the legislation is asking you to do is to come up with you know, do thinking about what your particular context is and what steps you need to take based on the assessment that you've made. I suppose in my mind, you know, and this is really just to reiterate, you know, what you've and echo what you've said, but I think, you know, the first point is, you know, what's the working environment like? What do you know about your particular culture? And the situations that people might be put in as a result of the role that they do, you know, and it may be just a small group of staff who are in a particular role. For example, that is customer or client facing, and they are working in a particular context or particular environment. So working environment would be the first thing, and then who are your staff? You know, I've already mentioned, you know, certain staff with certain identities more likely to experience sexual harassment. We know that from general research, general information. What does that mean for your staff? You know, how does that relate, and what do you need to be thinking about more specifically around different groups of staff with different identities, and what the implications might be for them? And then thirdly, it's about, you know, what do you know already through reporting, people, you know, having made complaints, people having spoken, people through an engagement survey. What are your findings there? How effective are your reporting processes? How do you actually get that feedback? And, you know, how equipped are your managers to deal with it? So it's taking a look at the whole piece for your organisation, your company, your wherever it is you work, and creating some sort of template or plan around how you're going to strategically do those assessments without going overboard. You know, making it simple, but making it effective.
I think that's important, Anne. I think the important piece as well is to engage with people across the organisation. It can seem quite daunting if you've got to do this on your own and carry that on your shoulders, but it's important to engage with people and for them to understand why you're doing it, because then they're more likely to comply and actually put those actions in place.
Yeah, actually that brings to my mind a conversation we were having previously about, okay, so who should do these risk assessments? You know, and this always lands on the desk, doesn't it, of the you know, the diversity lead or whatever, or maybe a colleague in the HR team. But I think, you know, I know you've spoken before when we chatted about this, about that collaboration. It's not, you know, you need to, and the other thing is, like, you know, this one person whose desk it may land on just doesn't necessarily have the capacity. But what's important to build awareness of sexual harassment in general, really, it's everybody's responsibility. So I think, you know, you might want to add more about that, you know, on who should we get involved in this risk assessment process.
I think a number of people from across the organisation, depending on your context again. So if it falls on your lap and you're in HR, that's great, you can be the lead, but actually it's working with somebody from health and safety to align with any existing risk assessments you've got in place already, but also with your commercial teams, with marketing, with finance, but also people in operational areas, because you don't know the risks in those different teams unless you speak to those people. You can only share your own experiences or what you've heard from incidents that have been reported. But particularly if you've got employees that travel or that don't work on site, their experiences might be very different to those who are based on the office or the premises of the company. So it's really important to have a little working group that's made up of people across the organisation to identify those risks and also then actions you can take to mitigate them.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thank you. Really good advice there. Okay, so we've talked about risk assessment, which I think we've probably started with because it feels that for many people it feels like the most onerous and difficult thing about this legislation. But what other actions do employers need to take? What other things do they need to think about when they're thinking about reasonable steps? This requirement to take reasonable steps.
Okay, I've got a long list, but I'll try and keep. I could talk. This could be a topic on its own. But I'll try and keep it as comprehensive as I can. But it's important to remember that the things that I'll mention now are the things that will be would go in your risk assessment. So it's important to know that you're not reinventing the wheel. Some of this could already be in place. So don't panic. But the key number one really is about having a comprehensive policy on harassment and how you tackle that. So that could be a standalone sexual harassment policy, or it could be built already into an existing dignity at work policy. But as long as you have a section on sexual harassment, that's really important to make that clear in terms of what it means, what are the implications for not complying with the policy, but also consult with employees when you're developing this policy, particularly your employee resource groups, and not just your women's network, but also, as you mentioned about intersectionality earlier, Anne, it's important to find out if you've got a diversity committee or a focus group. Engage with our employees to find out what are the issues that they're facing, to make sure that you have got that covered in your policy, and then you're more likely to get more engagement in the adoption of that policy. Once you've got that policy in place, it's really important to make sure that it's accessible to everybody, because there's no point in having a fantastic policy if nobody knows it exists. So that's often where organisations fail, is actually in the communication. So I would say communicate. Put it everywhere, you know, on your intranet, on your web pages, your HR SharePoint or web intranet pages, wherever you've got a handbook. Make sure that it's clearly clearly available, accessible, all of those things, but also having a clear reporting channels as well. So if an employee encounters sexual harassment, where do they go? How do they report it? And can you do this formally and informally? because often organisations want to resolve things informally, nip things in the bud early on if possible. If not, it might be more suitable to go straight down the formal routes. But it's very important to have those clearly available as well. But also make sure that people know the consequences then as well. So if somebody does behave inappropriately, what are the consequences, and make it clear that you have a zero tolerance approach on this and that you're taking it really seriously. Otherwise, people just think you're paying lip service to it, and it's just a tick in the box activity. Make sure that you engage and train your employees. Obviously, that's really helpful. And as Ciphr have got some great kind of courses and outlines on this that you can support your your clients on. But it's really important that managers, employees understand what is meant by harassment, sexual harassment, but also the impact it has on productivity, engagement, but also the fact that people will leave as a result of this, not to mention the negative kind of the reputational impacts as well. So that's really important. Also, respond promptly to complaints. Do not sit on things for weeks on end. Make sure that if someone complains, your policy, your procedure, make sure that it follows up quite quickly, so that people aren't. It's very stressful to go through this anyway for all parties involved. So you want to make sure that you respond appropriately, sensitively, and make sure that people know what the next steps are as well. But also, final couple of points I'd say is around monitoring and reviewing constantly. Like, where are your complaints coming from? If you're not getting any at all, why not? Is there this kind of still this fear of speaking up to try and understand what's going on? But also, the gold standard for this would be some organisations have specifically trained sexual harassment advisors or dignity at work advisors that employees can go to and discuss the incident or whatever it's happened in an informal way to get some advice, because actually sometimes going to HR or your manager can seem a bit daunting. So actually they might choose to speak to a trained advocate first of all, who would work with HR to help resolve it. Is that helpful?
Perfect. Sorry, just unmuting there. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's so much we could talk about here, isn't there? And I think you've absolutely highlighted the the main issues and the main points there here. You mentioned training. I mean, I think as any training, it's really important that this gets to it gets to the what, what is sexual harassment and understanding and awareness, but also gets to the why. Why are we talking about this? Why are we interested in this? The impact not only on individuals who are on the receiving end of harassing behaviour, but also the implications for the wider teams and the organisation. But also it's about the how, isn't it? And about what the expectations are in terms of behaviour. And I think it's really important that, that training is offered in a very clear way, but in a way that will engage everyone. I think, we've got a question in the chat about men. And, we need to make this a space where people can share thoughts, share views, share ideas, but really understand the context within which harassment occurs. Already mentioned that that finding around it's not always men who are the perpetrators of.
No, it's not at all.
It's not at all. That needs to be recognised. It is more the case that women are on the receiving end of sexual harassment, but it's not a one-way street.
There's a question on that and around that, isn't there? And I think it's really important to note the examples that you cite in your training to engage everybody, and actually the power imbalance can be the other way around, particularly in some industries. So actually it's making sure that we don't make sweeping statements. But there's also a quick question that I just wanted to answer now, Anne, in the Q&A around providing training for suppliers and contractors. My advice would be that you don't need to provide training to your suppliers and your contractors. It's more around sharing your policies, but also your stance on the zero tolerance. But also, if you can, if there's a way of building that into contracts around behaviours, I think that would be the way to go, because it's very onerous if you've got to provide the training. Those organisations should be providing training themselves to their existing employees. So I hope that helps, Lisa.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think it would be practically quite difficult for you to, get into another company and offer that training. But clearly setting out your expectations, and as Hiran said, in a contract if possible, and so that the suppliers understand the implications if they haven't recognised your commitment and the action that you're taking and your requirements as well. That there could potentially be some impact on the relationship between you and your supplier. So I would absolutely agree with that. Okay. The other thing I just wanted to mention about training, I was thinking about this. I think again, it's like training for different companies, different organizations isn't going to necessarily look exactly the same. It's about learning or understanding what the key issues or problems or incidences look like, and there might be a particular issue around banter in a particular team, or more broadly in a workplace culture. So again, work on the basis of what you know, on the basis of what you go ahead and find out, and make sure that it's whatever you deliver in terms of training is relatable. I mean, this is the same for any training that you do, but it's got to actually meet a need that people recognise, or respond to a situation that people can recognise in terms of their own particular context. So that's brilliant. Okay, so we've looked at the main actions that employers should take to comply with the new legislation, particular topics in terms of training, policies, reporting, risk assessment, etc. But of course, all these actions are set in that context of reasonableness. What are reasonable steps? We could spend our life working on this, or we could just give it a very cursory amount of attention. What is the judge? How do we judge what reasonableness is?
That's a good question as well. And this is very difficult, isn't it? Because such a grey area around what's reasonable for one organisation might not be for another. But I think the things to consider, or that would be considered, are the size and the resources of the employer, the nature of the working environment, when we talked earlier about what's the context of your specific kind of employer, in terms of the power imbalances, the historical kind of culture in there, the sector that they operate in as well. That's one of the things that would be considered, and the amount of steps you would need to take then to address some of the risks. Things like the third parties, how kind of frequent people interact with third parties, and what's the nature of those interactions. But also things like the time and the cost and disruption of putting the reasonable step in place, but also versus the impact that would have in a positive way. And the final thing really is, if you've put steps in place and they haven't been effective, what have you done to address that? Are you still getting claims of harassment, or just general complaints of inappropriate behaviour? It means that your steps aren't working, and actually you need to make sure that you've strengthened what you've got in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an important final point, isn't it? Have you acted on what you know, on what your experience has been? You might have had a particular case that you've dealt with. You've put in place a process, a procedure that you felt was going to work. You need to take a step back when all that has finished and think about what worked, what didn't work, how can we change, how can we improve, and then you need to demonstrate that you've tweaked, or you've thrown that process out and come up with another one, or you've added something. For example, you might have created this network of harassment advisors, or a first point of contact where people can turn, just a group of people who are trained to be a kind of sounding board for others to think about what has happened to them, and whether this is actually sexual harassment, you know, what has happened to me. And I think quite often that's something that's a challenge for, particularly in an environment where there's quite a normalized culture of sexual banter, maybe. And sometimes people think, well, you know, I've become so used to this,
yes,
I wouldn't label it as sexual harassment because it's just what goes on. But having somebody to speak to, so that just might be an added layer or an added action or an added initiative that you put in place as a result of a kind of review of what you've done. So I think that would all be part of, you know, what would be considered as reasonable for you to do. And again, one size doesn't fit all here.
Mm.
You know, if there was a challenge and there was a consideration of whether reasonable steps have been taken, it would be very much looking at the context that you're working in. Okay, all right, thank you. I'm just going to do a quick check of the time. Okay, so there's quite a lot of stuff there, really, in terms of the things that you need to do. We've just got a slide really to pull that together with the key points. So I'm just going to go through that very, very briefly. You'll be having the slides after the session, or you have access to those, so you can take a look in more detail. But then I think we've got quite a number of questions coming in, so we'll move to those in a second. So just to really pull together the points that Hiran has spoken to in terms of the action that you need to take, or the types of action, the types of areas that you need to consider. Your policy, comprehensive, robust, you know, what's going to work for you? Is it part of a wider dignity at work policy, or do you want to go down the route of creating a specific policy on sexual harassment? How do you know what's going on? Have you got some really sound and solid roots to understand what's happening? So that might be an engagement survey, you know, but how do you engage with your staff more broadly to help you understand what some of the issue, what might sexual harassment most typically look like within the context that you're working? How will you risk assess? Again, you know, tailor it to your own culture, your own context. Have a plan for that. Think about who's going to get involved with that. Reporting needs to be confidential options for reporting, but you also need to be able to identify trends. So, you know, you might be surprised at some of the things when you actually take an overview of the types of issues that have been raised. You might say there's a particular part of your organisation where there's an issue, or there's a particular manifestation of sexual harassment that's coming, that keeps showing up. Training, you know, particularly, well, all staff, but, you know, managers, how confident, how competent are they to actually handle issues? You know, do they know what to do? Do they know where to go? Spell out your process, your complaints process, and communicate that in a very open and transparent way. And again, going back, you know, reviewing the incidents of complaints, how they were handled, lessons learned, and the changes that you need to make as a result of that. Okay, so I think we can go to questions now. So Catherine, I don't know whether you wanted to pull out any questions in particular. I haven't had the chance to.
Sure, yeah, I'll pull out some of them. So thank you to everyone who sent in questions. Do send in further questions using the Q&A panel, and the ones that are in there, you can upvote. So that helps us understand which are the priorities for answering them. So I'm going to work down, so the ones with most upvotes we'll take from the top. Interesting question here from Christopher, who says, we recognise harassment shouldn't happen and we take claims seriously and we follow all the proper steps. If it's one word against another and we uphold the claim, why is there no legal protection for employers? How do we balance the duty of care with the legal risk? I'm going to open that to the floor. Obviously, we aren't employment lawyers, so we can't speak on the legal risk here. What we can speak to is steps that you can take to provide to guard against it and what the requirements are of the law. But we can't advise on how claims would be settled or anything like that, and each case would be individual.
Absolutely, and I think it's very difficult if it's one word against another, but this is where the full investigation, evidence, all of those things are really important, so that you have so the employee is supported on both sides, and both viewpoints are discussed to find out exactly what went on, because actually that can't be right if it's just one against the other. That's difficult to then prove either way. But actually the important thing initially in an organisation, I think, is to create the psychological safety where people can speak up, where people go, oh, actually it was only banter, I didn't mean it. But actually, if you felt that wasn't appropriate for you, you should be able to have that conversation either with the individual or somebody else, to try and nip things in the bud early on, rather than having to live with things until they get really out of hand, and then you have to kind of feel you've got no other choice.
Yeah, I think all you can do is state how you're going to deal with the complaint, follow your own procedure, which is always the way with these things, isn't it? And that's how to demonstrate that you've been reasonable in this. In a way, reasonableness is the employer defence. If you've set out very clearly what harassment is, if you've trained people to and communicated very effectively what it's all about, if there is a complaint, if you've put in place your processes, if you've adequately trained your investigators, all those things, it sometimes is going to be very difficult, because if it's one word against the other, but if you've done that due diligence in terms of your investigation, hopefully you will come to a reasonable decision, and you will be able to defend that. There's no reason why you shouldn't. And I also think there should be absolutely no hesitation in not upholding a claim if that's what you find. Absolutely, it's not always one-way traffic, or and I know I've been in circumstances and situations in the past where people have come to me and described a situation from their perspective, what happened, and I'm left thinking, gosh, that was so awful, that must have been awful to be on the receiving end of that. And then you speak to the other person involved and you think, okay, wow, people see things differently. People, because of where they're coming from, they have different perceptions and receive language, information, behavior, actions in a different way than they were intended. So I think you need to have that process that allows everybody the opportunity to speak and share, what their perspective or their report on what has happened. But yeah, absolutely, you can't. You can only work with the information that you have, and if you're confident about your procedure and your processes, you need to go with that.
Yeah, I think I would just add there, and I am by no means an expert in this field, but the evidence gathering can be broader than just interviewing the two people involved. There may be witnesses, there may be colleagues that you can speak to, just as you would for any employee relations case. And then you can also consider whether you would be accessing email or instant message records and bringing in that kind of data. So it's not necessarily the one word against another. There are probably data sources that you can draw from in order to make a robust decision that follows your policies. And my understanding of employment law, a lot of it is to do with, have you followed the procedures accurately? So that's why it's so important to have those policies set out really clearly and make sure that each process goes through the same steps. So thank you for that. Sorry, I'm really not an expert on it, but I'm just drawing on some other stuff that we've talked about. So I think this is a really interesting question from Hilary. Do you have any thoughts on how to promote awareness without it being too in your face or potentially triggering anyone who's experienced it before? That's feedback that they've had raised at their employee voice forum.
So interesting. I'd love to know more about what the feedback was, but that's a question for another time. I think that it's always important to start off these conversations around the data, as Anne did earlier in our session, on why you're doing this, because sometimes people don't realize how prevalent this is in certain sectors or in your own company. So look at the data, look at the feedback, and then demonstrate that you're addressing something that's a real concern, or why you're doing it as a result of the legislation. But I don't think it really should ever be a stick to beat people with. This is about making your organisation an even better place to work, where everyone can live and work with respect and dignity. So I think it's about the approach that you take and engaging the right people to communicate this in the right way. And that way it won't be too much in your face, I hope.
Yeah, I think it is really tricky, isn't it? Because, you want to, get to that place where, sexual harassment isn't a reality. So sometimes you can, that can feel very urgent. We've got this new legislation. You've got to take steps to do that. We've got to do something. We need to build that awareness. But I think it's all part of a bigger picture, unfortunately, about creating a workplace where people, it's really tricky. This I think this speaks to the whole, freedom of speech, freedom of expression versus what is harassment, and which is a difficult balance to strike. But I think, it's about giving people permission to say what they think, and helping people to, I use a phrase which I don't, particularly like, but I can't think of anything better. It's like to disagree without being disagreeable. Is to have different views, come from different perspectives, and recognise that, people do see things in a different way, and who knows what has happened to an individual in a previous, for the rest of their life. Things may have happened to people that cause them to react in a certain way to certain behaviours or certain events or certain language. None of us knows that. So it's trying to say, can managers working with their teams, can they try to encourage people to express different thoughts and opinions and views, and experiences, share experiences, where everybody listens to each other in an environment that isn't toxic, and unfortunately we have got to a place where these conversations do become very toxic and become very polarized. So I'm not sure that that's particularly helpful, but I think it's just part of a broader need to make the workplace okay, as Hiran said, a safe space for people to talk and share experiences, and that, this is why we're doing this, because some people are impacted by this in this particular way, and that's their experience. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. So next question from Katie. What are our responsibilities as an employer if we receive a complaint of sexual harassment by an employee from someone external? Would we follow our usual disciplinary procedures, but our primary responsibility is to prevent the harassment of our own employees?
So who would be the?
So if their employee was harassed somebody and working somewhere else, so it's kind of almost a reverse of that third party responsibility.
Okay, I've had experience of this, not personally, but in an organisation that I have worked with, and what's happened is that the other organisation has contacted us to say a member of your team has behaved in this way, behaved inappropriately, and that we've resolved that way, rather than it going through our, there's been some kind of consequences or conversations around what inappropriate behaviour is, and actually the protection, and not to behave in that way with third parties. But actually I've had the situation where the third party actually contacted our HR department to raise a complaint and followed their procedure.
Yeah, I think it's around, I absolutely, and I think we should be, we should value that feedback from another company, another organisation. I think, and then obviously it's about talking to our employee,
yes,
and finding out what their perspective on the situation. And again, there may be very different perspectives about the context for the complaint, for the report, and it might be you know, it wouldn't necessarily be a disciplinary procedure, but I think we should have in mind. I mean, it would depend on the situation, but you know, you might have in mind your organisational values and the expectations that you've laid out for behaviour of staff, employees in general, and whether that particular person has, you know, complied with those, has lived up to the expectations and the values of the organisation.
I think you're right, Anne. I think context is everything, isn't it? In terms of, is this repeated behaviour? Is it a one-off? It's all of those questions, and that would then depend. You know, the outcome would depend on that, wouldn't it? In terms of, is this something that's been going on a long time, and actually, is it going to bring the organisation into disrepute? All of those questions would need to be asked.
Yeah, and I think again that's speaks to the risk, doesn't it? Absolutely. You know, you don't want the other organisation, the other company to then, you know, sort of go public in some way about, you know, how your employee has behaved. You want to come to you want to show that you've dealt with it robustly and in an appropriate way. So, you know, I'm guessing, you know, there would be some feedback to the other organisation about what you've done, although, you know, I don't think you're obliged to do anything, but they will want to know that you've taken some appropriate steps to at least investigate and address the issue.
Yeah, I think part of that comes back to when you're enhancing your sexual harassment policies, making sure that it covers these scenarios and things like what professional standards are expected in terms of general behaviour, your values, like you say, and whether it would form anything to do with misconduct or anything like that. So it's kind of looking at all the policies and training you have in place in the round, and if you feel like it's a risk for you that might happen, then build it into your risk assessment and take appropriate steps. Thank you for that. Here's another interesting question from Lisa. Do you have a clear definition of zero tolerance, and what would that realistically look like in a workplace? It's a tricky one.
That is a risk. I think in the organisation I've worked with, that's around when something has been upheld. So actually, you know, there might be instances where it's the person the perpetrator, if you like, isn't aware of the impact of their behaviour. So initially it's a conversation, but then it's kind of quite clear early up front that we don't tolerate this. But actually, okay, you've almost kind of been given that warning first off. But if it's repeated behaviour and then it does lead to a claim of sexual harassment, then that's kind of really reinforcing that you don't tolerate that and there will be consequences as a result. And that isn't always dismissal, is it? It could be some development, some training, some coaching, but actually it's very clear that something will be done as a result of that behaviour, that we're not just going to brush it under the carpet.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting one. It's quite a challenging question there, to actually define it. I mean, to me, if you say you've got your approach is zero tolerance, it's saying that you will take very seriously any allegations, any indication that sexual harassment has occurred, and that you will investigate that and you will do everything in your power to stop it and to prevent it happening again and to take the appropriate action if it has occurred. So it's more of a kind of like, we're not going to ignore it. We're not going to ignore anything that comes up that could be sexual harassment. We're going to be proactive in that. Even maybe it's something that's come to your attention that isn't specifically it's not a formal complaint. But you, if there's any inkling of it, or you know, you're going to do something about it. That's you know, and what you do might be very different depending on the circumstances of the particular situation or the case or the incident. But zero tolerance says to me, we're going to tackle it. We have a commitment to tackling it.
Another way that you could kind of test the temperature on this, which I've kind of come across in all other organisations, is around in your staff surveys, asking a question around this. So, for example, do you think cases of bullying harassment will be taken seriously, or do you feel there is a zero tolerance culture here, and that's really telling, because obviously that is an anonymous survey then, and then you can understand if people really feel that the complaints will be taken seriously or not.
Yeah, absolutely.
That helps strengthen it sometimes. I've found that those findings have been really powerful in helping to change the policies and procedures.
Yeah,
thank you. I'm going to have to move us on from the Q&A now, because we are rapidly running out of time, which always happens when we're deep into some conversation. So, Anne, you wanted to talk a little bit about creating a speak up culture and the connection between that and the WPA and sexual harassment prevention, which we've been talking about.
Yeah, I'm only just going to talk about this very briefly, but I think it speaks to the wider context, and we've already mentioned some of this as well. So we've got the Worker Protection Act, and there are things that we have to do around sexual harassment specifically, which is what we've been talking about this morning. But I think it fits within this idea of creating a space at work where people feel that they can speak up in general, and they might be speaking up about all different types of things. They might be speaking up about sexual harassment, they might be speaking out about discrimination, they might be speaking up about different types of inappropriate behavior, or they might be speaking up about other forms of malpractice. It's about you want your employees to say to tell you what's going on, otherwise you can't address it. So it's about giving people that space, that confidence to actually talk to you. So if we could have just the next slide, Catherine, please. Okay, so we've mentioned some of this already, and I think it's about communicating. We've talked about zero tolerance approach for retaliation in particular, because a lot of people don't speak up because they're worried about the impact that will have on their career, on their prospects, on their relationships with others. Are they going to be penalised in some way? Are they going to be ignored? So, communicating that that people won't be picked on, that there won't be any retaliation or victimization if people flag issues. I think it's also about those different routes through which people can speak up, and we've talked about that, having different avenues, different groups or individuals that you can go to, who you can talk to, because what's okay for one person might not be okay for another, and if we're thinking about speaking up. I think it's also about making sure your leaders and managers really encourage that feedback, and that they welcome and validate that feedback, whatever it is, even if it turns out that you can't do a huge amount about it, but it's actually the action of somebody actually sharing something which is quite difficult for them to do, which needs to be recognised, and that's about inclusive leaders sometimes speaking up themselves to challenge something that they might see that's not quite right, which might put themselves in quite a precarious position, or it might be maybe quite difficult for them to do. And then I think finally, set this expectation that this is what we do. We speak up when we see something that's not quite right. And again, commend those who do. So I think we just need to take the new legislation in this wider cultural piece about how do we make people feel okay to share stuff that might be quite challenging for them to share. And that's not always easy, but it will help us to understand what's going on, and then help us to put in place the appropriate steps to address that.
Brilliant, thanks, Anne. So thank you, Anne and Hiran, for all of the questions and insights so far. It's my time now just to give you a quick overview of the ways that we can help you comply with the WPA and get your sexual harassment training, culture and activities up to scratch. Sorry, I've lost all my notes. So Ciphr e-learning, powered by the Marshalls team, you may recognise that name, are experts at developing off-the-shelf and bespoke content that moves the dial on diversity, inclusion and belonging. We offer hundreds of e-learning courses, including, most relevant to today, our sexual harassment course, which you can opt in for a free trial. You'll see that on your screen now. Just hit the button if you'd like to take advantage of that offer. We also offer off-the-shelf courses related to harassment and bullying and how to create a speak up culture. That's actually a small suite of courses that Anne's put together and led on there. The diversity practice led by Anne and supported by associate trainers and consultants like Hiran also offer face-to-face facilitated training sessions, as well as specialist advice and consultancy options. I've seen quite a few people in the questions asking for templates when it comes to risk assessment or to policies. We can help with those kind of activities as part of our specialist advice and consultancy. So whatever type of assistance you need in this area, we can tailor a support package to fit your needs, the preferences of your workforce and leaders, whether you're operating remote, hybrid or face-to-face, and most importantly, your budget. So you can find out more by visiting our website, it's ciphr.com, or if you'd like to discuss your requirements with one of our expert advisors, you can email us at info@ciphr.com. Do make sure to hit the link that you see on your screen now if you'd like to take advantage of that free trial offer. Otherwise, that brings us to the end of our webinar today. We have just about hit midday and kept it to time, which is awesome. Thank you, Hiran and Anne. So much insight and knowledge there. Hopefully our audience really appreciate that. And thank you everyone for sending in your questions and sharing your comments in the chat. I really appreciate your engagement and participation today. When this webinar ends, there'll be a short survey. Please fill that in if you can, just to give us some feedback on the format and content of today, and let us know if there's anything else that you'd like us to cover. Your feedback really does help us improve our webinars for the future. So thanks again, everyone. Appreciate your time. The recording will come to you via email later today. Please rewatch that if you need to recap anything or share that with a colleague. And we hope to see you again at another Ciphr webinar again soon. Take care. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye. Bye.